Thanks for the introduction, Joel. Today I'll be talking about some of the transition sow research that's been conducted. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge some of the partners for this research. One of the trials that I'll be talking about today was part of the Pig Livability Project. And this is a project that's a multi-institutional in nature. It's jointly being conducted by Kansas State University, Iowa State University, and Purdue, and is designed to be able to identify ways to reduce mortality in all phases of the pork production system. This project was jointly funded by the National Pork Board and the Foundation for Food and Ag Research. Another trial that I'll be talking about today was funded by the Minnesota Pork Board. We thank these funding organizations for being able to make this research possible. We've been able to partner with New Fashion Pork and Christensen Farms on two of the trials that I'll be talking about today. And I'll also mention some of the work that Dr. Kellner's group has conducted at AMVC. I think it's important to acknowledge these large swine operations because conducting sow research is not easy. It takes big teams to be able to conduct the research efficiently and accurately with lots of dedication at the farm level and lots of changes in operations. I think their willingness to be able to open their doors and be able to conduct the research with large numbers of sows, but more importantly, be able to share the research with the rest of the industry is what really makes this research applicable. Now, we all know that as genetics improvements have occurred, the size of our litters has greatly increased over the last decades. Unfortunately, this increase in litter size has also come with a reduction in average piglet birth weight. Other research that we've conducted here at Kansas State University has shown that piglet birth weight is directly related to survivability from birth to weaning. In these true trials, we show that as we increase piglet birth weight, survivability weaning also increases. Because of these two factors, people have begun wondering whether there's different ways that we can feed sows to be able to improve piglet birth weights and improve pre-weaning survivability. This transition sow feeding practices is not the same as bump feeding. We're not talking about starting feeding practices at approximately day 90 of gestation. However, the transition period is loosely defined as the 10 days prior to parturition, as well as the 10 days after parturition. However, when you think about trying to apply this transition period in modern production, how can we accurately and practically get it done? We either need to start feeding different treatments in gestation or move sows into the farrowing house on approximately day 105, which is not practical. Or we can start feeding sows approximately 2 to 3 days prior to farrowing at the time where they enter the farrowing house. And this is the area that we've focused a lot of our research on. Now, when we start thinking about transition sow feeding, there are a couple goals that we're trying to accomplish. One is to meet the changing requirements of fetal and mammary tissue growth development in the later stages of gestation. We also want to try and prepare sows for the upcoming parturition and lactation periods. We would like to supply nutrients during the farrowing to be available for the farrowing process to maximize piglet viability and survival. We'd like to try and improve quantity and quality of colostrum and potentially reduce farrowing duration. And when we think about transition sow feeding studies, this is a topic that's relatively new. However, it's something that the dairy industry has talked about for many decades. When we think about some of the trials that have been conducted with transition sow work, a number of feed additives have been tested, ranging from fiber, improvements or inclusions of HMB, different fatty acids, CLA, and phytase, some of which we've conducted here at Kansas State University. However, I'm not going to be talking about these specific areas of research looking at feed additives. I'm going to focus my attention on two larger buckets. One related to increased energy and protein, or feeding potentially lactation diets prior to farrowing. I'll be focusing on a trial that we conducted here at Kansas State University with Dr. Kia Gorley, as well as one that was conducted in Denmark with Peter Thiel's group. Second half of my presentation, I'll be focusing on the influence of meal size and timing on transition sow performance by looking at a study that we've conducted here at Kansas State University, as well as a study that Dr. Kellner's group conducted at AMVC. Now, when we think about the energy demands around parturition, they're relatively stable up until approximately day 107 of gestation. at which time there's a rapid increase in energy demand for both the sow and the fetus to support the increasing development of the fetus as well as the mammary and preparing the sow for the upcoming parturition process. The question that we have to ask ourselves, though, is can we supply this increased energy to meet this increased demand without creating excess body weight gain and back fat gain, without negatively influencing lactation feed intake, creating poor milking ability, or reducing litter growth? To be able to accomplish, to be able to test this hypothesis, we conducted a trial where we fed approximately 450 sows, one of three different treatments. And the treatments were increased energy and lysine immediately prior to parturition. The increased energy was at 13.3 megacals of ME per day, and 40 grams of SID lysine were fed per day. Both of these approximately double, or at least double, of what the control sows were fed. This increased energy and lysine was fed starting at either day 107 or 113 of gestation, where the control sows were fed the normal farm protocol. In this data set, we also were able to separate the response observed from between the gilts and the sows. And I think this is an important part of being able to understand what's happening in some of this transition sow research. On this trial, or on this slide right here, I show the improvement or the increases in body weight gain and back fat gain observed from sows fed the individual treatments, with increasing body weight gain and back fat gain being observed the longer we feed increased energy and lysine immediately prior to parturition. Even those that were fed the increased treatments for 3 days prior to parturition had a substantial increase in body weight gain and back fat gain compared to the control sows. This slide depicts our response on stillborn rates, where we did not statistically find a change in stillborn rates with the treatments. However, as we increased energy and lysine supplementation to the sows prior to parturition, we saw a numerical reduction in stillborn rates in both the gilts and the sows. This treatment did not observe any treatment differences on litter size, born alive, colostrum yield, or survival to 24 hours. In relation to body weight gain, we observed that increasing the amount of energy and lysine immediately prior to farrowing improved the body or the piglet body birth weight of live-born pigs in gilts, however not in sows, with increased energy and lysine immediately prior to parturition, resulting in an approximately 100-gram increase in the average birth weight of born alive pigs from gilts. Unfortunately, what we also saw in gilts was a reduction in litter gain throughout the lactation period. We did not observe any difference in sows, however. This trial was not able to measure average daily feed intake of the sows, and so we hypothesized that this reduction in litter weight gain during the lactation period may be reflective of a reduced feed intake of the sows, of those sows especially fed the higher energy and lysine immediately prior to parturition. In this trial, we also did observe an increase in IgG concentration in both sows and gilts when increased energy and protein was fed immediately prior to parturition. And this change in colostrum quality may be important for future pig livability. I'd also like to highlight another trial that was conducted out of Peter Thiel's group in Denmark, where they published a paper that had 3 different trials where they tested feeding gestation, lactation, or a transition diet, which they considered a 50-50 blend between the gestation and lactation feeds for 6 days prior to the anticipated farrowing date. In these 3 trials, no benefits were observed in farrowing performance, colostrum yield, milk composition, or survivability. However, one of the 3 trials did show improved litter gain during lactation when lactation diet was fed compared to the gestation diet. So in summary, these 4 trials that I've just talked about here today illustrate that there's minor benefits from feeding lactation diet or feeding increased energy and protein prior to parturition. However, there may be additional benefits observed for gilts, which warrants further investigation. Another topic that we'd like to talk about today is farrowing duration. And we know that as farrowing duration increases, the number of stillborn pigs per litter also increases. However, it's interesting that, again, some work out of Denmark by Fiera and others observed that as the time from the previous mill increases, the time from parturition from the previous mill increases, the duration of farrowing process also increases. Consequently, the idea was created to test ways to be able to shorten this window between feeding and parturition to hopefully improve or reduce farrowing duration. To help accomplish this, we conducted another trial with 727 sows. On this farm, the average total born was approximately 16, approximately 15 born alive. And the treatment started on day 113 of gestation, which was the entrance into the farrowing house. We accomplished the trial with 3 different treatments. One was a treatment where we fed 6 pounds per day, 1 time per day. We also had a treatment where we fed 1.5 pounds 4 different times per day. So it's the same amount of feed, just an increased number of meals. We also had a treatment where we allowed sows ad libitum access to feed starting at day 113 of gestation. And in this particular study right here, we did not find any change in farrowing duration as we increased the meal frequency or size. We were also able to measure the percentage of pigs that were assisted in birth. And we noticed that when sows were allowed ad libitum access to feed, the number of sows that we had to sleeve and pigs that we were pulled were greatest for the ad libitum treatment. They were lowest for those sows that were fed 4 meals a day of 1.5 pounds, and with the sows fed 1 meal a day being intermediate. Even though we had an increased percentage assistance with the ad libitum fed sows, we did not see any change in stillborn rate across treatments. When we looked at the impact of these feeding regimens on sow body weight and back fat change, we noticed from post-farrowing to weaning, the sows that were fed the ad libitum feed intake prior to parturition had the least amount of weight loss or back fat loss during the lactation period, with those sows fed 4 meals a day at 1.5 pounds having the greatest weight change and back fat loss, and the sows fed 1 meal a day being intermediate. We observed no difference in lactation average daily feed intake as the frequency of meals increased or the size of meals increased. And this is really important because a number of people would speculate that if you allow sows ad libitum access to feed prior to farrowing, we'll actually see a reduction in average daily feed intake during lactation. I think the big difference between this trial and some of those previous trials that would report the negative correlations is that we only allowed ad libitum access for approximately 3 days prior to parturition, whereas that influence on lactation sow average daily feed intake may be greater for the longer the amount of ad libitum access to feed is granted. However, even though there was no meaningful difference in lactation average daily feed intake among treatments, when we take also into consideration the feed intake prior to parturition, we see that those sows that were allowed ad libitum access to feed for 3 days prior to parturition had the total or the greatest total feed intake. And this is an important number with 6 kilos or approximately 13 pounds of additional feed being consumed by these sows, that we need to be able to generate additional benefits from sow productivity or litter productivity to be able to offset this increased feed cost. We did observe that increasing the frequency of meals fed immediately prior to farrowing improved piglet born alive birth weight, with the highest piglet average birth weight being observed from those sows fed 1 meal of 1.5 pounds, or sorry, 4 meals of 1.5 pounds a day. We also saw that an increase in piglet weaning weight was observed as we increased the frequency of meals, with those sows fed ad libitum access to feed having the greatest piglet weaning weight. When we start looking at outcome of piglets, this chart right here depicts the outcome from 24 hours after birth until weaning. The dark portions of the bars right here are mortalities. The striped bars represent those pigs that were deemed as fallback pigs during the lactation period. And what we noticed is that as we increased the frequency of meals, the percentage of mortality in fallback pigs was reduced compared to those sows fed 1 meal a day prior to parturition. approximately 3% fewer mortalities in fallback pigs when we increased the frequency of meals. This matched up very well when we looked at piglet outcome from birth until weaning. So when we increased the frequency of meals compared to only feeding one meal a day, we actually weaned a higher percentage of the pigs, whether it was from the pigs that were fed only 4 meals of 1.5 pounds or that allowed ad libitum access to feed. And yes, during this, the time that we were conducting this trial, this farm was on the backside of a PRRS outbreak. And so we were not able to do some cross-fostering. And consequently, the percent weaned was lower than what we'd expect on these operations and what we'd like. However, it was interesting to note that we still were able to observe our treatment differences, even though we were at the backside of a PRRS outbreak on the farm. I'd now like to switch gears and talk a little bit about the research that was conducted by Dr. Kellner's group at AMVC. They conducted a very similar study where the black bar right here depicts sows that were fed 2 meals of 0.9 kilos. The gray bars in the middle was 1 meal of 1.8 kilos. And then the white bar at the right-hand side were 2 meals of 2.7 kilos. This trial was conducted with 240 sows with average sow productivity about 16 total born and 14 born alive. The treatment started at loading into the farrowing house, which ranged from 2 to 10 days prior to parturition. In the trial that Dr. Kellner conducted, they noticed a reduction in stillborn rate when the frequency of meals was reduced compared to those sows that were fed only 1 meal per day. What was really interesting with this research is that prior to conducting this trial, Dr. Kellner observed an increase in stillborn rates within their system. However, when he implemented the results of this trial and began feeding more than one time prior to parturition, they noticed a significant reduction in the stillborn rates from a system-wide basis. And I think this does a really nice job of illustrating the application of the research trial to the value of the operation. So with that, I'd like to conclude some of the research that we've conducted on transition sow feeding. And in summary, there's been little overall benefit from increased energy or lysine or potentially feeding lactation diets prior to farrowing. Little overall benefit, but honestly not a significant amount of downside either. If anything, there does appear to be some benefits with gilts, more so than in sows. And I think this area really requires further investigation to determine if there's ways that we should be feeding our gilts differently than our sows prior to farrowing. However, there was a lack of convincing data with other feed additives fed prior to farrowing. Most of the trials that are out there are conducted with 15 or 30 sows per treatment, and it just takes a larger group of sows to be able to conduct and collect meaningful information that will be applicable to our industry. It does appear that increasing meal frequency prior to parturition could improve pre-wean livability, whether it's through a reduction in stillborns or an increase in pre-weaning survivability. However, we do need to remember to be careful not to over-condition sows. If we allow sows ad libitum access, as an example, for too long prior to parturition, we could create a situation that creates an increased condition on sows that could lead to poor lactation performance. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Mike Tokash to talk about some of the work that we've conducted with continuity of nutrient intake after weaning. Thank you.